over a 40-year period. And it requires the state to also be sure to demonstrate that we are good stewards and practicing water conservation to the best extent possible. So under that compact, which resulted, as I mentioned, in the Level of Lake Michigan Act in Illinois, the state of Illinois really is the privileged child, if you will, to use that analogy, under the compact, in that we are provided that much water that we get to use within the state of Illinois, and we get to manage that under our own programs. That's not the case in all the other remaining states or the Canadian provinces. And so other communities that want to access water, or entities that want to use that water, or create a new access to that right, go through a tremendous process that requires the approval of every one of the Great Lakes states governors. And so if you look at like a Waukesha, for example, in Wisconsin, and some of those other communities that are trying to access new water, the millions of dollars they're having to expend and the time and effort that they're having to go through to try and make a case to use even another drop of water out of the Great Lakes is extensive, and in many times results in an answer of no. And so it is a very, by design, a very cumbersome process intended to be very protective of the waters in the Great Lakes. But Illinois does not have to go through that process. Looking at Joliet as an example recently, we were able to issue that allocation to that community here coming in the next 10 years or so, based on the tight management of the system. And they did not have to hold public meetings in 7 other states and 2 Canadian provinces and go through that kind of protocols to get that water. In essence, irritates the other states that we have that capability. And so more than once in my 38-year career so far, the other states have tried to sue the state of Illinois to cut off our water. And so I guess that desire kind of remains in a general sense from the basin, that they look at us with kind of a raised eyebrow when it comes to the amount of water that we use out of the Great Lakes. And so that's why it's so imperative, so important that we manage this resource to the greatest extent possible to demonstrate that we are being the best stewards we can be of this water and practicing water conservation to the hilt in order to demonstrate that, so that when those suits come again, we can demonstrate to the Supreme Court that we are doing what is expected of us and we are being good stewards of that water. Even recently, with the onset of invasive carp coming up the Illinois River, there were states that were trying to utilize that fact and turn that into a reason to reopen the lawsuit and the settlement agreement against the state of Illinois to try and prevent us from using Great Lakes water. So that's why I want to make sure that everybody understands the importance and the precarious nature by which we have this water, even at our discretion in the first place, and why the program is set up to really preserve that right to continue to divert. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Jim Casey, who's gonna walk us through more of the operations and the details of that program. And then we'll open it up to have opportunity for questions and discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jim Casey. I'm the chief of the Lake Michigan Management Section for the IDNR. Steve, can we have the next slide? As Lauren mentioned, the Illinois' Lake Michigan diversion has been made available by a U.S. Supreme Court decree, which was issued in 1967 and modified in 1980. To implement that decree, the state passed the Level of Lake Michigan Act, which sets the Illinois Department of Natural Resources Office of Water Resources as the agency in charge of managing Illinois' Lake Michigan diversion. The department uses its Part 3730 rules, allocation of water from Lake Michigan, to implement and regulate Illinois' diversion. Next slide. Illinois' diversion is made up of three components. The first one being domestic diversion, which handles, we have approximately 217 allocatees or permittees that serves about approximately 8 million people in the northeastern Illinois area. The second one is direct diversion. Direct diversion is the amount of water that the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago uses to keep the Chicago area water system in a sanitary state and also at a certain level for navigation. The third component of Illinois' diversion is diverted runoff. So the Supreme Court decree says that all the areas that were diverted, all the area that used to go into Lake Michigan, all the runoff that was diverted to the reversal of the Chicago River is now counted against Illinois' diversion. Now, this can vary from year to year depending on weather. So if we have a wet year, the number is going to be higher, but the number can be as much as a third of the 3,200 CFS that we are allowed to use. Next slide, please. So I guess the point is that it's not just drinking water that's involved with Illinois' diversion. So Illinois' allocation program, as you probably well know, and any entity wishing to use water from Lake Michigan is required to petition the department for a permit for that allocation. The purpose of the allocation program is to allow the department to manage Illinois' diversion and its compliance with the Supreme Court decree. When an allocation is issued, it's usually for between 20 and 30 years out. That's based on available population projections. The allocations are based on a yearly daily average. So it's every allocation is how much the average daily use would be for a community in that year. Ideally, your allocation would exactly match your water use over its lifetime. That doesn't happen often, if ever. Communities are allowed to exceed their allocation by an average of 5% over a 5-year period, or 115% in 1 year. That's there to, we don't build in a buffer in our allocations for, say, drought years or peak use. We feel that is allowed under those exceedance levels. The department also has a non-revenue water standard, which is currently 10%, and that is based on your water loss versus your water use versus your water supply. The difference would be your non-revenue water. Communities, this is used as a conservation tool to track and prevent excessive water loss, which helps us keep in compliance with the Supreme Court decree. Any water system, any permittee that exceeds that 10% non-revenue water standard is asked to submit a water system improvement plan, which lays out a path to them getting back into compliance with that 10% standard. When making out or computing allocations for communities, the department does not allocate for non-revenue water that exceeds our 10% standard. Next slide, please. During this our reallocation period this year, or this time around, yes, we received a lot of complaints that the revised water allocations are affecting communities' water supply agreements. I would just like to point out that the purpose of the allocation program is to give the department a tool to track our water use and to help us stay in compliance with the Supreme Court decree. The allocations were never meant to be used for creation of water supply contracts. Next slide. Another comment we received during our reallocation process was that communities were upset that the proposed allocations were a lot lower than what they were in the last 10-year review. But all our allocations are based on actual use, historical use, population projections, and growth projections. So again, ideally, we like our allocations to be exactly what a community is currently using and hopefully will use in the future. The lower allocations this time around represent a regional trend of reduced water use over the last 10 years. So, I mean, we have seen communities' water use either stay stagnant or decrease over the last 10-year period. And again, the department does not allocate for water loss exceeding 10% of a community's water supply. If a community during the 10-year period to the next reallocation feels that its water allocation is insufficient, they're able to, at any time, petition the department for a modification. And also, while we're doing this reallocation process, if a community has any information that they feel was not included in the calculation of their allocation, we would hope that they would come to us and provide us with that information. And if that information is we deem correct, we will include it in our reallocation. Next slide, please. Another question we received is, or comment we received is that if a community needs to petition for a modification to its allocation, it could take several months and hinder growth in the community. The department's rules read, again, that the department may initiate a proceeding if a community's water use exceeds its allocation by 5% over a 5-year period or 15% in a single year. Keyword in that sentence is may. I don't think in my 29 years of doing this that we've ever initiated a proceeding with the community because their water allocation exceeded their water use exceeded their allocation because of growth. If the exceedance is due to excessive water loss, that's another issue. I guess what I want to get across here is that a community on Lake Michigan Water does not have to apply to the department for a modification for every new subdivision or industry that comes into the community. That kind of growth is normally handled. This is the reason we do our reviews every 10 years, is to capture that growth and hopefully capture future growth. Next slide, please. Now, keeping in mind that the reallocation is done every 10 years, permittees who disagree with their draft or revised allocations are encouraged to submit any information on proposed developments occurring in the near future that they feel were not included in the department's review. We would ask that you submit that information by November 1st, 2021, and you can send it to the contacts on the slide. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, that's the end of our presentation here. That kind of brings us to the question and answer session. We've already gotten a few questions already. I need to bring, let's see. Jim's unmuted. So we've already gotten a couple questions in the chat, and keep in mind it's we want all the questions today in the chat, and I will be presenting them to both Jim and Lauren. First question, in review of the online data for water allocations to communities, it indicates that 121 of the 216 communities exceed the 10% non-revenue criteria, that 69 of the 216, 32% exceed the 15%. Can you provide what steps ID&R plans to take towards enforcement of the 10% overage rule? And then a follow-up question is, does ID&R expect fines to be administered if communities are unable to bring non-revenue water below 10% within their filed plans to address non-revenue water? Will this apply to all 121 communities unilaterally, or will be on a case-by-case basis?
Sure, good question. And it's fair because the rules do provide for the capability for us to take enforcement actions. But really the program is intent on again, preserving and providing that domestic water supply. And so we're not in the business to find communities. We want to work with communities to come into compliance. And so that's based on this amount of acceptable water loss in a system that was codified by the Illinois General Assembly here just a few years ago related to that water loss. And so it's really our intent to work with communities under those, their plans for water system improvement plans to implement that. And really it hits on kind of a key point. And I'm glad the question was raised, because we as a region really need to take a serious look at our infrastructure. Of course, we know that infrastructure is kind of a hot topic these days, and the federal government is even looking at infrastructure, bills and improvement plans at the federal level. But it's really key that we pay close attention to our infrastructure systems and the amount of water loss. We are not intent on going out and issuing fines. We're more intent on trying to work with communities to implement those improvement plans. The IDNR has been in discussions with the Illinois EPA, who manages the state revolving fund, on how do we collaborate together? How do we help communities be able to apply for these kinds of resources that it's going to take to address kind of the worst problems in the region and set up implementation of improvement plans across the region. One of the things that I mentioned during Wednesday's session that I'll repeat here again is that I think it's important for us to think really as a family, if you will. We're a family of communities that are utilizing the same resource out of Lake Michigan, and we need to look at it that way, such that our weakest link in the family, or who's got the greatest water loss, impacts everyone else in the family and their ability to continue to develop and grow. So that's why really as a region, we need to look at, how do we support and get at taking care of a lot of this infrastructure to address the amount of water loss in order to preserve and best optimize the amount of water that we're provided. And again, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to demonstrate to the other states, Canadian provinces, that we are seeking to be the best stewards of the water that we're allowed to provide into our systems.
You have a follow-up question to that. Jim Casey elaborated on questions that Dave Bennett processed through the Mayor's Caucus after the webinar on Wednesday. Can Jim please clarify the statement related to specific developments or industries that have projects should either be under construction or proposed to begin in the near future, 2 to 3 years, with existing community approvals? Does this mean that developers need to have permits in hand before IDNR will consider the allocation increase?
That comment was meant for the reallocation process. There's two avenues. One is when we're in the process of doing a reallocation, if a community has development that they feel is been not included in their proposed allocation, they can come to our department and say, hey, we have these 5 subdivisions or industries that we feel are coming online within the next few years, and we feel they weren't included in the department's calculation of our allocation. At that point, we will take that information, compare it to CMAP populate projections, and if we feel they weren't included, then we will include the proposed water use for that in the community's new allocation. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Jim. Let's see, the next question we have here. Will IDNR share the steps in the process to petition for additional approval, and how long will the process take?
So that process is laid out in our Part 3730 rules, and it is a process, right? It involves hearings and so forth for that petition. I think the important point to get across here, though, is, of course, as Jim just answered, if you have existing development, or you've signed on the dotted line for development, that's a done deal. If we haven't reflected that, let us know about that ASAP. But going forward, as you're seeking to do development and expansion, that can happen at the discretion of the community. And so again, we're not here to delay that or in any way kind of hinder that. Develop as you see appropriate. If that development keeps you within your allocation, great. There's no need to really collaborate with us. If you see that development and that expansion is going to cause you to go over 105% of your allocation over a 5-year average, or exceed 15% of your allocation in 1 year, I guess the message is come talk to us. Again, going back to Director Callahan, it's all about communicating, collaborating, connecting. If we need to know that, let us know that that's happening, and that's when we would potentially go into that process. Now, if it's happening in a year or two from today, and all of a sudden, ta-da, major development has come to your community, causing that kind of a drastic increase, then maybe we do need to talk about going through that reallocation process in that interim period. But in no way is that intended to stop or uphold any of that development, right? You don't need our authorization for that development. As it's happening, first of all, congratulations on that kind of development and expansion. But again, just collaborate with us and we'll seek to do that. Now, should that happen, say 6, 7, 8 years from now, that comes more to fruition and actually faucets are on and water mains are open and that kind of water use is happening. Again, come to us, let's talk, let's make sure we're aware of what the needs are and where the water's going for actual water use, not water loss. And we may decide, you know what, we're going to just readdress that in the next 10-year reallocation. That's part of the purpose of this every 10 years or so reallocation, is to reflect how have conditions changed. Has water loss, or not water loss, has water use gone down in a particular area? Has water use gone up in a particular area? And how do we need to reshuffle the deck there for where the water needs to be? So again, that process is outlined in our 3730 rules, and it is a process, but it's not something that's there to hinder or in any way stop continued development in your community. Thank you.
We got another question. Can the speakers provide some insight on how Chicago meets IDNR criteria for non-revenue water loss? Substantial number of their customers are unmetered.
Chicago, like every other community, has to submit a water system compliance plan if they are not in, if their non-revenue water is greater than their 10% limit. Yes, a lot of their customers are not metered, but they play by the same rules as everybody else.
Okay. We had another question. Will IDNR prepare an FAQ to help answer these and future questions? I think I can answer that one. We definitely will. We're going to be putting these recordings on the IDNR website. We are going to collect those questions, and any additional questions you may have, feel free to forward to Jim, forward to Jay, forward to myself or Lauren. We want to be as open with you as we possibly can. Next question would be, if your community has contested the revised allocation, how long do you anticipate that response to take?
I anticipate, well, we just met this morning with their consultant, and any community that hasn't received a response should be getting one in probably early next week, if not today.
Municipalities without an allocation who would wish to petition, is there an allocation capacity available, and how long does the process take starting from scratch?
It involves, the process involves notices, notices in the paper, notices to all our other permittees. It's really more or less driven by the ability of the applicant to supply the department with the sufficient information that it needs to make a decision. It also requires, a pre-hearing and a public hearing, and then it goes to our to the hearing officer to write up an order and make a recommendation. So I mean, it's not a short process, but it probably goes 6 months or so.
Thanks for response there,
Hopefully,
Jim. Okay, our next question is, with the allocations being changed, understand that we need to be responsible water consumers. How does this affect the huge allocations that will be allowed to service a new community in the Joliet area, and recently Wakanda and Bolo? Hard to justify current users lower their allocations with allowing such a great amount of water to serve new communities.
Once again, you want to do that, Warren?
I'll start and you can
I mean,
jump in, Jim. I guess the point is, as Jim talked about the three, reasons for the diversion: domestic water supply, the direct diversion into the Chicago area waterway, and then the rainfall runoff. With a third of that being the domestic water supply. That is one of the primary reason why we are so diligent and so careful with our diversion is for domestic water supply. That's part of the purpose. One of the things I would mention that we did talk about on Wednesday as well is the fact that the groundwater is also part of Lake Michigan in a way, and so that's part of what prompted the suit by Wisconsin back in the 60s was the Chicago, Northeastern Illinois region area utilizing so much of the deep aquifer. And so there's, as you look at the rules and the level of Lake Michigan Act and those documents, it definitely mentions the need to get communities off the deep aquifer, because that's an aquifer that we share with the state of Wisconsin, the state of Indiana in some cases. And so that groundwater is also part of the consideration, not just the surface water in the lake. And so as communities come in that are on that same deep aquifer, there is a desire to put them onto the surface water of Lake Michigan to continue avoiding the depletion of those deep aquifer resources that the other states also rely on as well. Jim, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just like to add that the reason the allocations are lower this time is because communities have been using less water. Our allocations are based on your historical and future water use. They have nothing to do with Joliet or any new user coming on. The allocations are not lower because we issued an allocation to Joliet. They're lower because over the last 10 years, your water use has been lower.
Okay, we did have a question. Apparently it has already been answered. We have plenty of time for questions, folks. If you've got something, please put it in the chat. So
we are, I'll use this opportunity to voice in that we are looking forward in the program, right? We're looking at trends of water usage, and we're looking at ways that I certainly have been on my soapbox trying to advocate for additional staffing resources and so forth that we can work with communities to help with the implementation of water system improvement plans. And so, for example, one of the discussions we've had with the Illinois EPA is, okay, we've got a state revolving fund that can help us address that, but we have communities, again, I'll use the family analogy, we have communities within our family that find it challenging to know how to even go from an implementation plan to a project plan that we can put forward for requests to the Illinois EPA or for the revolving fund. And so we're having discussions about how do we create resources to help the region, help those communities be able to deal with our water loss and creating those kinds of projects and seeking those kinds of resources. So I do want to share with the group that we're not just always looking in the rearview mirror. We're trying to look forward and create ways to really improve this program and help us as an entire region with Illinois be able to move forward with confidence that we have the water that we want going forward in the future. Thank you.
We just got another question. Will the agency be willing to provide written assurances that additional allocation will be available if a community finds itself exceeding allocation due to development rather than water loss?
Again, don't we're not here to give permissions for your development. Please develop as your community sees appropriate. And because we have managed the allocation program very carefully, that water is available at this point. And we'll certainly, if for some reason we had a huge expansion in the entire region here in the next 10 years, we would certainly be sharing that and having those kinds of discussions. But at this point, communities should feel free to continue to seek that development and move forward in that way as they see appropriate. And then we'll deal with the water supply, providing that water or changing those allocations if appropriate based on your allocation.
The next one's a good one, and I think you'll be able to handle this one, Lauren. Has Illinois sued the other states recently regarding allocation issues? Didn't Wisconsin allocate water outside the watershed?
We we haven't actually sued. I know those kinds of discussions occurred. Primarily, we get into Illinois' participation in the Great Lakes Governors, Great Lakes St. Lawrence Governors and Premiers Compact Council and regional body. And those are the groups that essentially are the regulators of that water use, like is referred to here in Wisconsin. And that water, for example, does have to be returned to the watershed. So again, Illinois is the only entity in the region that takes water and sends it outside of the basin. And so those type of issues are discussed and considered and challenged in some cases in order to assure that that water is returned to the Great Lakes Basin by the state of Wisconsin, and those are taken into consideration on those straddling communities for that purpose. And so, quite frankly, the other states are regulating the heck out of each other when it comes to those kinds of conditions and those kinds of bordering communities and where they're just outside the Lake Michigan watershed and issue those kinds of water allocations. And so that, again, just like the states are closely watching Illinois, all the states closely watch any new request for water in or along those straddling communities in the basin. And so by our involvement in those efforts, we've not chosen to sue, but to really make sure that the provisions that have been developed under the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Compact are carried out appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you. Would sewer separation projects and combined sewer communities tributary to Lake Michigan have any impact on overall water allocation?
Any water that doesn't, Illinois' diversion is measured in many ways, but one of the ways is the amount of water passing the city of Lockport. So any water that can be prevented from making its way into the Chicago water system and then downstream past Lockport would lessen the amount of water counted against Illinois' diversion. In essence, would make more water available for water allocations.
I do think building off that comment, and as Jim discussed, not only is our diversion broken down into, the domestic use, the direct diversion for water quality and those type of issues in the Chicago area water system, and then the runoff. The actual accounting of that diversion is quite sophisticated, and I guess I would um, suggest that we probably should have some additional follow-up educational webinars like this that help explain all that goes into that diversion. It's really eye-opening on the complexity that goes into actually that annual accounting that the federal government charges the Corps of Engineers to be responsible for on the oversight of the diversion. So there are many, many factors that go into that besides just the gauge there at Lockport that's measuring flow in the Des Plaines River, coming out of the system. So for a future note, we'll probably seek to develop that kind of a webinar education session to help everybody in the family, if you will, understand the complexity and the many factors that go into creating that final number. So thank you.
I have another question. We received a water allocation from the city of Chicago for 999,000 gallons per day for the next 10-year contract. How does this work with DNR?
Again, I'll go ahead, Jim.
I'm sorry. Assuming you're have a Lake Michigan water allocation, the department issues permission or an allocation for the use of Lake Michigan water. We do not get involved with who you buy water from or any part of your contract with who you buy water from.
That comes back to that slide that was in the presentation with the three circles, and that there's a line of connection between communities and the water allocation, and there's a separate line between the communities and the actual water supplier. But there is not a line at the bottom connecting the bottom two circles between the suppliers and the DNR allocation.
Another question, much of the information is good news, needs to be in a formal written document so permittees can move forward with assurances that this approach will not change as administrations change over time. Would either one of you guys like to respond to that comment?
I can say that the allocation program has been running for 40 years and it hasn't changed. And we've seen several administrations. So I don't see it changing anytime soon.
And again, we, as Steve suggested, we're going to be creating those frequently asked questions. We're posting these kinds of presentations on our website. That information is there to share how the program is functioning. If it changes over time, we're hoping it changes for the better in the eyes of the community. As I said, the improvements we're looking at to the program that would include how do we better work with those allocatees and those communities to address our infrastructure needs and water conservation improvements and so forth. So any changes I would hope would build off the program we already have in a positive manner. Thank you.
And I'd like to add to that too. One of the this is one of the challenges when we decided to have these webinars from some of the feedback we received recently, is that we've been doing this for over 40 years, and as you in the communities know, have changes of administration, changes of people now in your public works department. We're really working to outreach to all of the allocatees so that they have an understanding, and going to try to do this on a more regular basis so that we don't have as much knowledge loss when there is a change in administration, so that making sure that a lot of the concerns that you have will be addressed.
Steve, I'd like to hit on one point, and Jim maybe already made it, but again, is that diversion is divided into that domestic use and direct diversion and the runoff. It's that runoff component that is kind of our wild card. And as we've already seen here a couple of years ago when we had a very wet year in the region, that causes our diversion to go up. In fact, I think we may have even exceeded the 3,200 CFS, but again, that under the compact, we're required to maintain that on a 40-year average. So, for every year that we're under that, we in essence put water in the bank, and every year that we're over that is a withdrawal out of the bank of that water. But to me, that's also very, very concerning as we look at the way that our climate is changing and some of the intensity and the rainfalls that we're getting in the region. And so we have to, again, going forward with the program, always keep an eye to that and know that we have to be very considerate of, as we get those intense storms that come into particularly the North Branch, Chicago River watershed there, and we have to account for every bit of that rainfall that and runoff that occurs from those storms. That is a key component of the overall program and diversion. And so as we get the climate change and those increased rainfall and runoff, we certainly have to plan for that as we go forward in the program. Thank you.
Okay, got a question from CMAP. Will IDNR be analyzing how climate change could impact the runoff portion of the allocation?
Oh, we definitely, I mean, that's part of what's included in the accounting. So we are definitely keeping a close eye as to how we deal with that impact. We have, for example, we do have the flood control project that was recently constructed that does provide kind of that deep tunnel connection from the North Branch back to the North Shore Channel. That in a way that does kind of help offset some of that. Should conditions get so extreme, perhaps we'd have to look at more closely at creating other kinds of projects like that allowed us to return some flows to Lake Michigan, but especially for those involved in that existing project, that's a very expensive endeavor. But Nora, we are watching those conditions very closely, and again, that's part of the annual diversion accounting that we have to keep track of, and so that helps us monitor those trends and how that's impacting our actual diversion numbers. Thank you.
We did get a question in the Q&A, which I didn't even realize was open. But a question they had of us is how are we appointed, the OWR folks, and who appoints us?
How are we? So within DNR, I am the only appointed one involved in the program. I am appointed by the governor to serve on an at-will basis. So as far as appointments go, the director is an appointed position, and then those that serve, like in Jim Casey's position, that run those sections of the agency, those are on term appointments, 4-year term appointments that are also approved by the governor's administration. Thank you.
Next question we have is, while it is understood that IDNR does not guarantee the allocation meets water purchases, but there should be some coordination because of the very nature of system improvements and expansion, there needs to be some assurances.
I mean, again, the purpose of the water allocation program is to manage Illinois' diversion of water from Lake Michigan. We have never gotten involved with purchase agreements or where a user purchases their water or how much they pay to purchase their water or any details of the contract. And I don't think that's something that our program is meant to do or should do, actually.
And we manage it very tightly in order to allow for that growth and expansion of appropriate use of the water.
Do we have any other questions? Give it a couple more minutes here. Thank you for all attending the call today. This has been, it's a learning experience for us as much as it's a learning experience for you. We love the feedback.
I guess I'll voice in closing as well that the reallocation numbers are still in draft form, but we are in need of at least putting those some finalization to that. Again, as we've already talked about during this whole session, there is still flexibility there as growth continues to come to your communities over the next decade. But if there is an allocation, if there is something that we've overlooked in this reassessment, reallocation, we really need to get that information in. I think we had it by November 1st because we do have contracts with our consultants that have helped us in this endeavor that will be wrapping up, and so we need to get those things set and move forward. So if you have information that you believe we have not considered, please contact us and get that information to us ASAP.
Okay, if we have no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the meeting. So thank you everyone for attending this. We look forward to be putting this on our website here in the next week. And thank you very much, and we'll see you next time, and have a great weekend.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your participation.
Yes, thank you.